July 18, 1944, Normandy, France. Lieutenant Joe Ironhide Kelly stands in the turret of his M4 Sherman tank, watching German Panzer IVs maneuver across the wheat fields near Canny with the kind of confident aggression that comes from knowing you have superior armor. His crew calls their Sherman scrap metal because that's exactly what everyone says it'll become the moment it faces real German armor. The Sherman's 75mm gun can barely scratch a Panzer's frontal plate at combat range, while a single German 75mm round can punch through the Sherman's armor like tinfoil. The math is simple and brutal. In a straight fight, the Sherman loses every time. Kelly's tank has already taken 2 hits that morning, glancing blows that left scorch marks on the hull and rattled his crew's nerves but didn't penetrate. His driver, Corporal Mike Sullivan, keeps muttering that their luck won't hold, that the next German shell will cook them alive in their steel coffin. The radio man, Private Danny Chen, has started composing goodbye letters in his head. Even the gunner, Sergeant Tom Reardon, who never shows fear, has his hand trembling slightly on the traverse wheel. They're supposed to be holding this position until reinforcements arrive, but the reinforcements are 3 hours away and the Germans are advancing now. 7 Panzer IVs are rolling toward their position, spread across a kilometer of open farmland, and Kelly's Sherman is the only thing between them and a critical supply depot holding ammunition for 3 infantry divisions. Command expects him to delay the Germans, maybe knock out 1 tank before withdrawing or dying, whichever comes first. Nobody expects him to win. What happens in the next 63 minutes will rewrite American tank doctrine, prove that inferior equipment in the right hands can demolish superior machines, and turn a worthless piece of scrap metal into a legend that German tankers will speak about in hushed, disbelieving tones for the rest of the war. The Sherman tank earned its reputation as a death trap, honestly. Between D-Day and late July 1944, American armored divisions were learning a painful lesson that pre-war training had never prepared them for. German tanks were better, not marginally better, catastrophically better in almost every measurable way. The Panzer IV, Germany's workhorse medium tank, mounted a 75mm KWK-40 gun that could penetrate 89mm of armor at 500 meters. The Sherman's frontal armor measured 51mm on the hull and 76mm on the turret face. Those numbers meant a Panzer IV could kill a Sherman from nearly any angle at combat ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. The Sherman's 75mm M3 gun, firing standard M61 armor-piercing rounds, could penetrate roughly 68mm of armor at 500 meters. Panzer IV frontal armor measured 80mm. The penetration chart told tankers everything they needed to know. You can't hurt them frontally, they can hurt you from anywhere. The kill ratios reflected this disparity with mathematical precision. First Armored Division records from June 1944 showed American Shermans achieving roughly 1 kill for every 4 tanks lost when engaging Panzer IVs. Against the heavier Panthers and Tigers, the ratios became obscene. 8 Shermans lost for every German heavy tank destroyed. Crews called the Sherman the Ronson after the cigarette lighter because it lights first time, every time. The nickname was dark humor masking genuine terror. When an armor-piercing round penetrated a Sherman's hull, it typically ignited the ammunition stored in sponsons beside the driver and assistant driver. The resulting fire gave crews roughly 15 seconds to evacuate before stored shells began cooking off, turning the tank into a blast furnace. Survival rates for Sherman crews whose tanks were penetrated hovered around 50%. The Germans knew it and exploited it ruthlessly. American tank doctrine in 1944 still operated under pre-war assumptions that proved catastrophically wrong in Normandy's hedgerow country. The doctrine called for using tanks in mass formations, overwhelming enemy positions through numerical superiority and speed. That worked against fortified infantry positions but failed utterly against German armor. The hedgerows, ancient earthen walls topped with dense vegetation that divided every field in Normandy, negated American advantages in numbers and coordination. Tanks couldn't see more than 100 meters in any direction. The close terrain meant engagements happened at ranges where German guns could penetrate Sherman armor with devastating efficiency, while American return fire often bounced harmlessly off angled panzer plates. Officers at 1st Army headquarters received daily reports of tank losses that read like casualty lists from World War I. 3rd Armored lost 17 Shermans on July 10th. 2nd Armored lost 23 on July 12th. 4th Armored reported 31 destroyed or disabled on July 15th. The replacement pipeline couldn't keep pace. Factories in Detroit were producing Shermans at extraordinary rates, roughly 2,000 per month, but Atlantic U-boats and the logistics of moving tanks across 3,000 miles of ocean meant replacements took weeks to reach France. Armored divisions were operating at 60 to 70% strength, with exhausted crews getting minimal rest between missions because there simply weren't enough tankers to rotate units properly. Morale in tank battalions was deteriorating rapidly. Crews understood they were driving inferior machines into combat against an enemy with better equipment, better training, and intimate knowledge of the terrain. Some tankers began deliberately failing equipment inspections or reporting phantom mechanical issues to avoid missions. Others requested transfers to infantry units, reasoning that at least as a rifleman they could dig a hole and hide, while a tank was a bullet magnet that drew every anti-tank weapon within a kilometer. Company commanders reported men vomiting before missions, not from fear of combat, but from the specific dread of burning alive in a steel box. The tactical situation at Cagny on July 18th crystallized everything wrong with American armor doctrine. Kelly's platoon had been ordered to support an infantry advance across open ground toward the village. The attack stalled when German machine guns opened up from concealed positions in the hedgerows. Kelly's platoon leader, a lieutenant fresh from Fort Knox who'd been in France for 9 days, ordered the tanks forward to suppress the machine gun nests. Standard procedure, exactly what the manual prescribed. The Germans had been waiting for exactly that response. The moment Kelly's platoon emerged from the cover of a sunken road, 2 Panzers hidden in a tree line 800 meters away opened fire. The first round hit Kelly's platoon leader's tank dead center on the frontal armor. The Sherman's bow machine gunner was killed instantly as spalling fragments ricocheted through the interior. The driver got out through his hatch. The other 3 crew members burned. The second German round destroyed the trailing Sherman in Kelly's formation, hitting the turret ring and jamming the turret in place. That crew bailed out under machine gun fire. 2 made it to cover. The 3rd Panzer shot took out another Sherman, this one an ammunition detonation that lifted the turret completely off the hull and dropped it upside down 20 feet away. Kelly watched 3 of his platoon's 5 tanks die in 40 seconds. His own Sherman took a hit that struck the side skirt armor at an angle and skipped off, leaving a groove in the steel but not penetrating. Pure luck. He screamed at Sullivan to reverse into the hedgerow behind them. The 5th Sherman, commanded by Sergeant Bill Morrison, managed to retreat without taking fire, disappearing into the maze of hedgerows before the Germans could get a 3rd Panzer shot lined up. Kelly and Morrison were now the entire American armored presence in this sector. 2 Shermans against at least 2 Panzer foes, probably more. The infantry had gone to ground, pinned by machine gun fire with no armor support. The radio crackled with battalion demanding to know their status. Kelly reported 3 tanks lost, requested instructions. The response came after a long pause. Hold position. Reinforcements en route. ETA 3 hours. 3 hours. In tank combat, 3 hours was an eternity. The Germans weren't going to wait politely for American reinforcements. They'd advance, destroy Kelly and Morrison, roll over the pinned infantry, and continue pushing toward the supply depot. Kelly could hear the Panzers' engines already, that distinctive whine of German Maybach engines that every tanker learned to recognize and fear. This was the moment when most Sherman crews would withdraw, reporting the position untenable against superior enemy armor. Battalion would understand. Nobody expected 2 Shermans to stop a German armored thrust. The manual had no doctrine for winning this engagement because winning wasn't considered possible. Kelly was supposed to die heroically or retreat tactically, and those were the only 2 approved options. What Kelly did next had no precedent in American tank warfare and violated every principle taught at Fort Knox. He ordered Morrison to follow him, turned his Sherman around, and drove directly toward the German positions. Kelly had realized something in those terrible 40 seconds watching his platoon die, something that nobody at armored school had explicitly taught, but every experienced tanker eventually learned if he survived long enough. The Sherman couldn't win a gun duel with a Panzer IV at 800 meters, but at 100 meters, angles changed, armor penetration calculations shifted, and most critically, the psychological dynamic transformed completely. The hedgerow terrain that had seemed like a death trap could become an advantage if you stopped thinking like a tank commander and started thinking like an infantryman who happened to be inside a tank. The Germans expected American Shermans to fight at range, using their excellent gun optics and stabilization systems to throw rounds downrange while maneuvering for better positions. That's what the doctrine prescribed, what the training emphasized, what every engagement in North Africa and Italy had reinforced. Kelly was about to do the opposite. He was going to take his scrap metal into knife fighting range where neither side had any advantages except reaction time, crew coordination, and pure aggressive audacity. Sullivan, driving, couldn't see where they were going through his narrow periscope, but he could feel Kelly's boots tapping directions on his shoulders, the basic communication method when radio silence was critical. 2 taps left shoulder, turn left. 3 taps right, turn right. Steady pressure on both shoulders, stop. Sullivan had been driving for Kelly for 8 months, and they'd developed an almost telepathic connection. He didn't question the orders, even though every instinct screamed that driving toward German tanks was suicide. Chen, the radio man, sat in the hull beside Sullivan, monitoring the radio while simultaneously feeding ammunition to Reardon in the turret. His job was theoretically communication, but in combat everyone became an ammo handler because the gunner couldn't reload the 75mm main gun and maintain sight picture on targets simultaneously. Reardon, the gunner, was the key to everything Kelly planned. A former competitive shooter from Pennsylvania who'd grown up hunting deer in thick forest, Reardon had the fastest target acquisition time in the battalion. He could spot movement through the narrow gunner's periscope, identify whether it was friendly or enemy, and put a round on target in under 4 seconds. That speed would matter desperately in the engagement Kelly was orchestrating, because once they penetrated the German perimeter, they'd have multiple targets appearing from multiple directions with 0 time for deliberation. The plan Kelly whispered over the intercom was insane. Use the hedgerows as concealment to get within 200 meters of the German position, then exploit gaps in their formation to engage individual panzers from the flank or rear where armor was thinnest. The Sherman's 75mm gun could penetrate 68mm of armor at 500 meters frontally. Against side armor, that same gun could penetrate over 90mm at 200 meters. Panzer IV side armor measured 30mm. At close range, the Sherman's gun became adequate, even devastating, if you could get the shot before the Panzer traversed its turret toward you. The first hedgerow penetration happened at 14:37 hours. Kelly's loader noted the time later when writing his after-action report. Kelly's Sherman burst through a gap in the vegetation and found itself 150 meters from a Panzer IV that had been advancing cautiously toward the American lines. The German tank was oriented perpendicular to Kelly's position, crew apparently scanning for targets to their front, completely unaware that an American Sherman had flanked their position. Reardon already had the gun trained toward where Kelly's navigation suggested a target should appear. The German commander spotted Kelly's Sherman half a second after they emerged, his head snapping around in the cupola. Too late. Reardon fired. The 75mm armor-piercing round hit the Panzer's side armor just below the turret ring, penetrating cleanly and detonating inside the fighting compartment. German tanks didn't burn as readily as Sherman's. Their diesel fuel was less flammable than American gasoline, but a penetrating hit in the crew compartment meant instant incapacitation. The Panzer lurched to a stop, smoke beginning to pour from the hatches as the crew bailed out. First kill, 6 to go. Kelly didn't wait to confirm the destruction. Sullivan was already backing the Sherman into the hedgerow before the German crew finished evacuating, disappearing into the vegetation as return fire from other Panzers began raking the area where they'd been. The Germans had seen the shot, knew an American tank was operating somewhere in the hedgerow maze but couldn't pinpoint exactly where. Kelly had achieved temporary invisibility, the one advantage Shermans could exploit in this terrain. The engagement that followed became a lethal game of hide-and-seek played with 30-ton steel machines. Kelly would navigate through the hedgerow passages, using the ancient earthen walls as concealment, emerging at unexpected angles to catch German tanks oriented the wrong direction. Morrison, following Kelly's lead, adopted the same tactics. The two Shermans became ghosts, appearing long enough to fire, then vanishing before the Germans could coordinate a response. The key was speed and unpredictability. Kelly never emerged from the same gap twice, never followed a predictable pattern. The Germans were fighting a conventional tank engagement, trying to establish sight lines and coordinate fields of fire. Kelly was fighting an ambush, using terrain and surprise to negate every German advantage in armor and firepower. At 14:42 hours, 5 minutes after the first kill, Kelly's Sherman burst through another hedgerow 300 meters south of his previous position. A Panzer IV was advancing cautiously down a farm track, its commander exposed in the cupola scanning for threats. Reardon put a round into the Panzer's rear engine deck where armor was thinnest and fuel lines were exposed. The tank didn't explode dramatically, but it stopped moving, engine compartment erupting in flames. The crew evacuated, second kill. Morrison scored the third kill 2 minutes later, catching a Panzer that had been repositioning to respond to Kelly's attack. Morrison's gunner hit the Panzer's side armor at 180 meters, a perfect shot that penetrated and detonated the ammunition storage. That one did explode, turret lifting off the hull in a pillar of flame. 3 Panzers destroyed in 7 minutes. The German response began organizing. Kelly could hear radio chatter on the German tactical frequencies. His radio man Chen spoke some German and translated the frantic commands. The Panzer commander was trying to regroup his remaining 4 tanks, pulling them into a defensive hedgehog formation where they could cover each other. That's what doctrine prescribed when facing an ambush. Consolidate, establish mutual support, force the attacker to expose themselves against coordinated fire. It was the correct response, and it would work against conventional tactics. Kelly didn't plan to use conventional tactics. He planned to be so aggressively close that the Germans couldn't coordinate without risking friendly fire. At 14:49 hours, Kelly did something that should have gotten him killed and would later become a case study in armored warfare textbooks. He drove his Sherman directly between 2 Panzers that were moving to join their commander's defensive formation. The Germans were separated by roughly 400 meters, both focused on reaching their assigned positions, neither expecting an American tank to be operating in the gap between them. Kelly's Sherman appeared from a hedgerow, crossed an open field at maximum speed, and disappeared into another hedgerow on the far side before either Panzer could react. It was a 12-second sprint across exposed ground, and it positioned Kelly's tank exactly where the German commander didn't want it, inside his defensive perimeter. The fourth kill happened at 14:51 hours. Kelly emerged from concealment 80 meters directly behind a Panzer IV that was still moving toward its assigned position in the German defensive formation. This close, the engagement became almost point blank. Reardon's armor-piercing round hit the Panzer's rear armor, penetrated completely, and the explosion of ammunition and fuel was immediate. The crew never got out. Kelly was already moving again, Sullivan reversing the Sherman back into cover before the burning Panzer's smoke could give away their position. Morrison got the fifth kill at 14:54 hours, also from inside the German perimeter. He'd followed Kelly's sprint across the open field, and now both American Shermans were operating behind German lines in terrain the Panzers had assumed was secure. Morrison's gunner caught another Panzer turning to respond to Kelly's latest attack. The German crews so focused on Kelly's position that they didn't see Morrison's Sherman until the 75mm round hit their side armor. The Panzer slewed sideways as the right track broke, immobilized. The crew bailed out under machine gun fire from Morrison's bow gunner. 5 Panzers destroyed or disabled, 2 remaining, and the German commander was now in full retreat mode, trying to extract his survivors before they all died. Kelly caught the 6th Panzer at 14:58 hours. The German tank was reversing rapidly down a farm track, commander trying to break contact and reach the safety of prepared positions 2 kilometers south. Kelly's Sherman appeared from a side hedgerow, having anticipated the Germans' retreat route through pure tactical intuition, or possibly luck. Kelly himself could never explain it clearly in later interviews. Reardon fired at 120 meters into the Panzer's side as it passed perpendicular to their position. The round hit just behind the driver's compartment, penetrating and killing the driver instantly. The Panzer careened off the track into a ditch, immobilized but not destroyed. The crew evacuated successfully, but the tank was out of action. The 7th and final kill came at 15:03 hours, exactly 26 minutes after Kelly's first kill. The last Panzer IV was retreating at maximum speed across open farmland, abandoning any attempt at tactical maneuvering in favor of pure flight. Kelly's Sherman and Morrison's Sherman both had shots, but Kelly's gunner Reardon fired first. The range was 450 meters, longer than Kelly had been engaging, and the shot probability was low against a moving target. Reardon's round hit the Panzer's rear turret bustle where ammunition was stored for the main gun. The detonation was spectacular, the entire rear of the turret blowing off as 80 rounds of 75mm ammunition cooked off simultaneously. The Panzer's hull continued rolling forward for another 50 meters on momentum before crashing into a stone wall. 7 Panzer IVs destroyed or disabled in 1 hour and 3 minutes. Kelly's Sherman had accounted for 5 personally, Morrison for 2. Neither American tank had taken a penetrating hit, though Kelly's Sherman had collected 3 more glancing strikes that left scars on the armor but didn't compromise the crew compartment. When battalion arrived 3 hours later as promised, they found the wreckage of 7 German tanks scattered across 2 square kilometers, smoking testimony to an engagement that shouldn't have been survivable, much less winnable. Kelly's crew sat on their Sherman's engine deck smoking captured German cigarettes, still processing what they just survived. Morrison's crew was hosing down their gun barrel, standard maintenance after heavy firing that nobody had expected to need because nobody expected to fire that many rounds and still be alive. The German prisoners, captured from the Panzer crews who'd successfully bailed out, couldn't quite believe what had happened. Their commander, a captain with 2 years of combat experience on the Eastern Front, kept insisting there must have been more American tanks. He'd reported facing at least a dozen Shermans, possibly more, operating in coordinated ambush positions. The idea that 2 American tanks had destroyed his entire company through pure aggressive tactics violated everything he understood about how Shermans fought, how American tankers operated, how the material superiority of German armor should determine engagement outcomes. The mathematical reality was undeniable: 7 destroyed Panzers, 2 intact Shermans, and a complete reversal of the expected kill ratios. Kelly's after-action report, filed that evening while the memories were still fresh, would circulate through 1st Army headquarters within 48 hours and reach George S. Patton's desk within a week. Patton, who understood aggressive tank warfare better than any American commander, immediately recognized what Kelly had discovered. The Sherman wasn't inferior if you stopped fighting the way the Germans expected and started exploiting the few advantages the Sherman actually had: reliability, crew comfort that allowed sustained operation, and in Normandy's hedgerows, the ability to use terrain for concealment in ways the German doctrine didn't anticipate. The tactical revolution that emerged from Kelly's engagement spread rapidly through American armored units in July and August 1944. Tank commanders who'd been fighting defensively, trying to use long-range gunnery to offset their armor disadvantages, began adopting Kelly's aggressive infiltration tactics. The close-range ambush became standard procedure in hedgerow country. Crews learned to use terrain ruthlessly accepting risks that previous doctrine considered suicidal because Kelly had proven those risks could produce asymmetric results. The kill ratios began shifting. By September 1944, American Shermans were achieving parity with German medium tanks in the Normandy fighting. Not because the Sherman's armor got thicker or its gun more powerful, the tank specifications hadn't changed, but because American tankers stopped accepting the premise that they had to lose. Kelly's engagement demonstrated that tactical audacity and terrain exploitation could overcome material deficiencies. The Sherman remained a death trap if you fought stupidly, but Kelly proved it could be a lethal weapon if you fought smart. The psychological impact on American tank crews was profound. Instead of approaching each engagement expecting to die heroically, they began expecting to win through superior tactics. Morale recovered. The requests for transfers to infantry units stopped. Crews started naming their Shermans with aggressive monikers instead of gallows humor. Kelly's scrap metal became famous, the name spreading through the armored divisions as a symbol of redemption. If scrap metal could kill 7 Panzers, then every Sherman had potential waiting to be unleashed through proper employment. The Germans adapted too, learning that American Shermans were more dangerous in close terrain than they'd believed. German tactical doctrine began emphasizing avoiding hedgerow fighting, pulling armor back to open ground where their range and armor advantages could be employed effectively. This adaptation inadvertently helped American infantry, as German tanks became less aggressive about pushing into close terrain, giving American foot soldiers more freedom of maneuver. Kelly's hour of violence had rippled across the entire tactical situation in Normandy. The Sherman's reputation never fully recovered from its early disasters. Even today, historians debate whether it was adequately designed for the war it fought, whether American industrial capacity prioritized quantity over quality, whether crews were sacrificed to flawed doctrine and inferior equipment. Those debates miss something essential that Kelly's engagement revealed: the quality of equipment matters far less than how you employ it. The Sherman was good enough when American crews stopped fighting German battles and started fighting American battles, using speed, audacity, and terrain instead of trying to win frontal armor duels they were never going to win. Kelly survived the war, rotating home in December 1944 after accumulating enough combat service points. He never commanded tanks again, returning to civilian life as a construction foreman in Philadelphia. He rarely spoke about July 18, 1944, uncomfortable with the attention, insistent that Morrison and his crew deserved equal credit, that Reardon's gunnery had done the real work, that Sullivan's driving had kept them alive. When pressed, he'd admit that the engagement hadn't felt heroic in the moment, just desperate, just trying anything that might work because the conventional approach meant certain death. The Sherman tank that Kelly called scrap metal never made it home. She was knocked out in October 1944 near Aachen, hit by a German 88mm anti-tank gun at 900 meters while supporting an infantry assault. Kelly had already rotated out, but his replacement crew survived, bailing out successfully when the ammunition caught fire. The tank burned down to the chassis, a total loss, and was scrapped in a field depot. No memorial marks the spot. No museum displays her burned hulk. She was one of thousands of Shermans destroyed in the European theater, statistically unremarkable except for 1 hour in July when she proved that scrap metal in the right hands could rewrite the rules of armored warfare. The doctrine that emerged from Kelly's engagement remains foundational to modern armor tactics. Current U.S. Army training emphasizes aggressive maneuver, exploitation of terrain, and psychological dominance over the enemy. The M1 Abrams tank is superior to any Sherman in every measurable way: better armor, better gun, better everything. But the tactics Abrams crews learn at Fort Benning trace their lineage directly to a lieutenant in Normandy who refused to accept that his inferior tank meant he had to lose, who drove toward the enemy instead of away, and who discovered that sometimes the best response to overwhelming firepower is overwhelming audacity. 7 Panzers in 1 hour. They called his tank scrap metal until it proved that the only scrap metal on the battlefield was burning German armor scattered across French farmland, destroyed by a crew who fought smarter instead of dying conventionally. So the next time someone tells you that you can't win because you don't have the best equipment, the fanciest tools, or the most resources, remember Lieutenant Joe Kelly and his scrap metal Sherman. Sometimes the biggest advantage isn't what you're driving, it's how you drive it. If you enjoyed this story of how one tank crew rewrote the rules of armored warfare, smash that subscribe button. We've got dozens more untold World War II stories that'll make you question everything you thought you knew about history. And here's a question for the comments. If you had to pick a nickname for your own tank in World War II, what would it be and why? Drop your best tank names in the comments below. Bonus points if you can make me laugh. Thanks for watching, and remember, it's not about the medal you're given, it's about the medal you bring to the fight.